Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. Happy TGIF. It is Friday at 10:49, November 5th already. So um, hope everyone has some fun plans for the weekend. My thing that I'm really looking forward to is going to see the Kill Bill saga. Fingers crossed everything works out. I'm gonna go see it tomorrow with a good buddy. Super excited about that, and I will definitely do a big review for that show coming up, probably Sunday morning. And everything, fingers crossed it all works out. We do have the right time, the right place. So very very excited about that. I put up a little video a couple days ago about my anticipation for the whole bloody affair, the re-release of both Kill Bill films back to back. Really excited. It's gonna be, definitely a long night, or a long night of movie watching, but I'm used to that. That's a good thing. I can do that. That's not a problem. And I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really excited because, and plus I just haven't actually seen those movies in a super long time. And I remember seeing both of those films when they came out. I remember seeing both of them twice in the theater. So amazing. And, arguably the best thing Tarantino's ever done. I mean, as far as the sheer scope of it. And it was such a departure, such a different thing for Tarantino to do as a director, as far as tackling action films, like making, and his really taking a big swing, and because he's always, Tarantino's always talked, throughout the years about his deep love of Asian cinema, Hong Kong action movies, martial arts films. So it's an amazing feat, or it was an amazing feat. So, like, a crowning achievement in his career. So, and those movies are so, I think, part of, or greatly influenced by exploitation movies. Really, all of his films are too. I mean, all of them. Jackie Brown. I mean, you go through the whole list. The only film I think of his that doesn't necessarily have that kind of gritty exploitation feel, even though it is a gritty film. It's more of I don't know, it has more of a '70s kind of Hollywood crime vibe, but it doesn't necessarily have um like that exploitation vibe, or that exploitation influence. Would be Reservoir Dogs, even though that is such an amazing film. But everything else, I think, has that real '70s exploitation vibe, from everything from Jackie Brown, big time, to Inglorious Bastards. I mean, just But anyway, The Hateful Eight, big time. I mean, obviously the Sergio Leone, all the Italian westerns, all that stuff. Um, but quickly, without going off on a tangent, I saw this thing which made me, in all honesty, really disappointed in Tarantino, and I thought it was, at first, when I saw the the blurb, or the article online, I thought maybe it was just a fake kind of bullshit story, like so much stuff is online, where you have to, like, it's clickbait, and you got to, like, actually look at it and, like, do a little bit of investigation, because when you first see something pop up in your feed, when it's related to news, so much of it is just, there's so much garbage, and you have to really kind of dive in and find out. But Quentin Tarantino was just on Bret Easton Ellis's podcast, and he's been a guest on that show before. I do like Bret Easton Ellis. I mean, he's made some really great books, or he's published some great books. He has directed some great films, most notably um, American Psycho. Just an amazing book. Really great film adaptation with Christian Bale. And he's done a lot of great movies. Less Than Zero is another one, another great book. he's a pretty controversial figure, but he has a podcast, and Quentin Tarantino was just on there recently, and it was unfortunate. I again, when I first heard about this story, I thought it was maybe some kind of fake thing or something. But apparently, in this interview, and it is factual, he did just out of nowhere attacked Paul Dano, the actor who is, who is a terrific actor. I mean, terrific actor. I think one of the best actors in his generation. And I have no idea why Tarantino called him out and just like totally trashed him to the point that he did. I mean, really, I think by Tarantino, the actions of Tarantino really, he really looks like a, he really makes him look like an immature dickhead and really unprofessional and kind of really shitty that he did that. That he would call out an actor for no reason. I mean, you can like who you like and don't like who you don't like, but when you're in a position of power, like Spider-Man says, great power comes great responsibility, and I hold true to that. I think everybody should have that, but especially when you have the clout or power that Tarantino has, which is the highest of the high, you gotta have a little bit of couth and a little responsibility. And by him saying or doing what he did in the interview by calling out Paul Dano, I'm like, yep, that was a real dick move. Like really, really shitty, really stupid, for no reason at all. So that was very disappointing. Very disappointing to hear. But anyway, on the plus side, I've been taking deep dives. Decided to take some deep dives from new angles on some movies that I deeply, deeply love. And that's what I've been doing with. I watched this movie the other night, and goddamn, this movie is just so badass. From 1981, Andrea Bianchi's Burial Ground, one of the greatest, one of the greatest Italian zombie movies ever made. And I watched this again last night. I've seen this movie so many goddamn times. And this was a movie I saw a few times when I was a kid. Also, I remember clearly as a kid, walking in the aisles during the days of the old VHS days. The old, the old time in the '80s, mid to late '80s when VHS was like the next evolution of technology. And I remember, clearly like it was yesterday, walking in the aisles and seeing this cover, and I was like, "What is that?" And I remember renting it as a kid, and it was just. It might have been one of my first Burial Ground. Might have been one of my first like Italian horror movies that I had ever seen. The other one that I have a real distinct memory of is seeing House by the Cemetery by Lucio Fulci, my favorite director, my favorite horror director of all time. And then I also remember seeing Dario Argento films, of course, Suspiria, probably the most well-known and most popular movie in kind of the Italian horror exploitation world, and rightfully so because that movie is a masterpiece. But Burial Ground was definitely one of the first, and it was such a unique. I remember even too, even at a young age, and I definitely think it now. I definitely think my mindset has changed, now big time. But I remember at a young age, like obviously seeing, horror, being exposed to horror films as a kid, seeing Friday the 13th. The original Friday the 13th was the first horror movie I ever saw in my life, which was also the first slasher film I had ever seen. And then I remember seeing Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween, shortly after that. And then I dove into the entire, Friday 13th franchise, which today still remains as that's my favorite horror slasher franchise of all time. And then also once I got way into that, then it was, Halloween, the Halloween franchise. After seeing the original, and then right around that time was when I got exposed to. Well, I should say also that was also when the Nightmare on Elm Street films came out. So I remember seeing them too, right around that time. Those three kind of franchises were like more or less the first horror films I saw, and I had seen like, by that time I'd also seen Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock's. Like that was my first exposure to anything by Alfred Hitchcock, and so those were all unique, all American made horror movies and slasher films. And shortly after that, I remember seeing, my first. I remember seeing movies like House by the Cemetery and Burial Ground and Suspiria, and then also seeing Tourist Trap, which today is still my favorite horror exploitation movie of all time. So, and I remember when I first saw, got to see the Italian films for the first time. I mean, as much, again, don't get me wrong, as much as I loved the, you know, iconic figures like Jason Voorhees, Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, and it wasn't until I was out of high school that I wasn't it wasn't until I was in college that I saw the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because it was really funny, and I've talked about this before, but my mom always, we always watched scary films, horror films growing up. My mom's still into horror films. We still watch horror films together. But the only two movies that were, I guess, banned from my house that I was not allowed to watch was Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Exorcist, because my mom felt those movies were too real, too scary, and they were at this different level. They weren't like, they weren't funny, they weren't comical, and goofy movies. These were like really serious. So those movies, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original, and The Exorcist, I didn't see until I was in my 20s, until I was like in college. So it was pretty wild. But everything else we watched all the time. But I remember even at that young age, like thinking, wow, Italian movies are so different than, in general, European movies in the horror genre were just really different than the American films. Because I remember, and again, I think this even more now. There's like a real distinct difference, but I remember even at a young age, I'm like, wow, these movies are just like more nasty and just more gritty, and they're more violent, and they're more kind of depraved, and I remember even thinking, wow, a lot of these Italian movies are they have a cheaper look to them. Like you can tell that the budgets for a lot of these films were not as high as compared to, say, the Friday 13th films or what have you. And they just had this like unique, and not just Italian films, but really any of the European horror exploitation movies that were coming out in the 70s and 80s. They just had this really, kind of gritty, dirty, sleazy vibe to them. And that is a feeling I have even more now that I've been, over the last 5 years or more, just been diving in fully to these movies, and just kind of becoming obsessed with them and reliving. A lot of this stuff too is tied to nostalgic, to like a nostalgic period of my childhood. So, and I have to say again, I've watched this movie so many times I've lost count. But the Burial Ground is, again, it's such a broad genre and it's such a huge genre. There's so many films tied to the zombie genre. But I have to say, Burial Ground is probably at this point my favorite zombie movie ever made. This movie is just so dirty and nasty and just gritty as all hell. Like, and the pacing is just unbelievable. The the It keeps the intensity of this film is just like literally 5 minutes in, you're pulled into this movie, and it's unrelenting, like it really is, from the beginning to the end, and that level of suspense and the kind of the thriller aspect of it just goes for the jugular the whole time. It keeps that level of intensity the entire time, which you don't really see. You have a lot of films that have maybe a slow burn, or there's a slow, kind of introduction to what's going on, being brought into this new world. But this film just goes for it. And one of the strengths of this movie is just the atmosphere. I just think the atmosphere is so tangible. It's just so creepy. The special effects in this movie, the practical effects are just unlike anything else. The sound effects are just, it's such a gross zombie movie. It really is. It's just such a gross movie. And it's really fucking sleazy as hell too. It's super sleazy. It's got some really demented shit in it. I mean, it's just amazing. And I just did a so I'm taking an extra deep dive with this movie because I just love this movie so much. So I just uploaded a show on the director Andrea Bianchi, amazing Italian director. I did a deep dive on his career. He's also the director of obviously Burial Ground. So amazing. And so today I'm going to do a show on the film score for the Burial Ground because it really is one of my favorite soundtracks. I think it's a really great blending of styles of, I mean, there's like electronic music. There's a big electronic component to the soundtrack. There's a jazz element, which is really, really cool. Like the whole intro music is all like kind of jazz based music. And there's also a very like psychedelic vibe to it as well. And it has a very dark, obviously very creepy foreboding vibe, and but then it also has some kind of real weird kind of melancholy colors to it. So I wanted to do a show where I'm going to be just talking about the composers for this amazing film. There were there was two composers for the for Burial Ground, which came out in 1981. Elsio Mancuso and Berto Pisano. They're under the pseudonym of Burt Rexon. So there were two composers for Burial Ground, and again, I love the just kind of the insanity of the kind of the flavor of this soundtrack. I really think, there's so many components that make up a film. You have, well, obviously the writing. You got to have a pretty good cast or good solid cast. You have to have, a really big part. Almost one of the biggest parts of a film is the editing. A director can get, the greatest footage in the world for his story that he's trying to tell. But if it's not pieced together well, it can be kind of a disaster. And so editing is such a major part, maybe almost the most major part, because I've heard so many stories for over the years of checking out films that I really love, and kind of the technical process of making films, where even movies that have like won massive amounts of awards over the years, like really critically acclaimed films, where I've seen interviews with the directors and the filmmakers where they've said, they knew, like, once they watched the dailies of the footage that they got, and they would watch, even they do a loose kind of cut of the film where they just have everything together. They knew that they had something really special, like right away. I mean, Ridley Scott talks a lot about that with like Alien, when he directed the first Alien, of like when they first saw the dailies of it, they're like, wow, like there's something really here, like this is special. But realizing, through test screenings that it wasn't, telling a story yet. And so it took a long time, and it does take a long time to get that right because, again, you can have the greatest. You could have, a director could have, shot the greatest footage on planet Earth, but if it's not, cut right and put together right, it doesn't really matter. So it's very interesting. And so the cinematographer, the cinematography for a film is incredibly important. That really sets up. That really brings you as a viewer to the story, the the world building, and trying to, being pulled into that world, and also hopefully wanting to inhabit that world for that time. And the film score is incredibly important too because that really creates the mood and the vibe. I think the film score and soundtrack component of a film is incredibly important because that really sets the tone. It and especially in films that where there might not be, say, a lot of dialogue. It might not be driven. It might not be, particularly action filled or action packed, especially the first half of the movie. It might be even slow. But the pacing, obviously the editing, but then the film score, the when to augment certain kind of emotions is so important. And I think this film score is kind of the one of the primetime examples of that because it really is such a powerful thing, and I feel like the film score for the Burial Ground is definitely one of my favorites. I just think it's amazing. I wish I had a few years, about 3 or 4 years ago, when I was buying a lot of Blu-rays for a lot of these movies. A lot of the movies came with CDs of the soundtrack, and in the last couple of years, my purchases, I have not come across that, which I've been super bummed about. I do have some really good soundtracks. I have The Living Dead Girls, which is a totally wild and bizarro French zombie exploitation movie. I have that soundtrack, which is really awesome. Um, I have a few soundtracks for some Lucio Fulci films. I also have the soundtrack for a movie, another soundtrack I'm going to be talking about, The Strange Vice of Miss Ward. This is an amazing giallo film by Sergio Martino. I'm going to be doing a show on this soundtrack. So I have a pretty good. I also have the soundtrack for one of the greatest slasher movies, and it's also kind of a giallo film. Pieces, Spanish film, amazing. I have that on soundtrack. So I have quite a few, but it's been a while. I haven't seen CDs in any of these packaging formats in a while, which is kind of disappointing. Because I would absolutely love to get the soundtrack for Burial Ground. Because and again, it has the thing I love the most about it. Particularly, this movie is so action driven, and there are so many sequences where people are being eaten alive and just like and it's so gory and just like demented. The music is becomes so intense and so psychedelic, which I think is amazing. And I'm a huge fan of psychedelia music, in general. So that's a big part of this too. And I also, again, I listen mostly. I love all kinds of music, and I listen mostly. But at the end of the day, I listen mostly to electronic music and then also jazz music. And this has all those elements. Very electronica, lots of old sounding synths, and the title, kind of the opening sequence or the introduction. Well, kind of once we're into the film of the Burial Ground, there is some jazz music that's really really great, and it really is kind of surprising because it's not what you would expect. But then it gets more and more sinister and dark as you go. And I love that there's elements of jazz in this soundtrack and also electronica. And it gets very, and I think there's even elements of really kind of avant-garde, aesthetics or sounds, which again, it's all stuff I love. When I went to look up information about the soundtrack, I found that who that were two composers for this film, which was a pretty interesting surprise. Elsio Mancuso and Burt Pisano. There, I couldn't really find all that much more information about these guys. It's kind of interesting, and they went under a pseudonym of Burt Rexon, which is kind of interesting. But man, what an amazing soundtrack! I love how it also feels like the way this soundtrack was recorded. It just has this really incredibly raw quality to it, and it feels like these guys were in the studio and they just kind of went for it. It has this very almost like improv kind of vibe to it. I'm not sure if that is true or not. Maybe it was heavily composed and orchestrated, with like sheet music and things, but it feels like it's so in the moment and kind of improvised. Because that's one thing you do see a lot when films, and it's kind of I guess more or less the main way that a composer will create the music for a film. Typically a director will, they're on this really tight schedule, and they will, get as much, shooting done throughout the day and the night. And then as they go, they're collecting, dailies, and dailies are basically, looking at the videos of the footage they got. And they usually a lot of the times, like, they'll have when a film is being shot, they'll in between takes they'll a lot of times the director and the assistant director and even the crew, a lot of the times they have a monitor where the cameras are positioned, so as they're shooting, they try to get as much as they can, because there's always like budget restraints and time restraints, and then a lot of times if a film is being shot outside, they have to worry about the lighting and all those things. So there's lots of restraints, and a lot of the times what they'll do is they'll try to get as much footage as they can, and then or almost and even too as they go, they'll watch the dailies, they'll watch the stuff in the monitor, and they can kind of tell right away if it's working, and that might, or if it's not, the scene looks really great, but maybe the take isn't great, so sometimes they have to do obviously many takes of a certain film. And then a lot of the times at the end of a long week or end of a long day, the director and the team on the film will watch the dailies, maybe with some of the actors, and they'll sit around and just like check out, you know, what the vibe is, if it's looking really, really good or not. And then what they typically do, in the whole process of making this film, they cast everybody. From what I've seen and read over the years about the process is, the director then will, like, whoever that director has hired to be the composer, a lot of the times they will assemble some footage for the composer, and they will send that to the composer, and then they will write music in accordance to that. Sometimes you'll see the process of where the director will have these real meticulous meetings, where or these meetings where they will really take a deep dive into what the vision of the film is, and the composer will maybe start that process on his own. but a lot of the times they will send them the footage of. I mean, I've seen one of the things that stands out that I remember hearing about was, when Trent Reznor did the film score, and Atticus Ross did the film score for David Fincher's um, their first their first collaboration, The Social Network, which is an amazing film, one of the greatest film scores ever. I've seen interviews with Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, and they said that that's what they would do is like, they, and especially this was their first time doing anything like this before. They'd never done, film score work. David Fincher would, send them, dailies, basically, shots of like, short takes or long takes. And they would be in the studio, Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor in their recording studio with all of their synths and all their analog synths and their equipment, and they would just kind of like create stuff in the moment, like just throw ideas, throw in, it's kind of that, and it's also the same kind of process for people who just write music a lot of the times. Sometimes, sometimes from a writer or composer's perspective, or their where that music or art comes from. Sometimes people will just, they'll wake up and they'll hear a melody in their head and they can just write it down. And some people, some composers or writers or songwriters describe it as like, well, the song kind of wrote itself. I had this melody in my head, or came up, I woke up the next day and I was able to it just came out of me. And then, but that's, I don't know, I think that's pretty rare. I mean, you have really prolific songwriters that is, that is a thing that's a very common practice for them. But a lot of the times, a lot of artists describe it as, you just have this blank canvas and you're just like throwing all these ideas. You're just like you're brainstorming, and it's like a stream of conscious, and you're just throwing all these ideas and seeing what's going to stick to that canvas. Different colors, different vibes, and all those kinds of things. So it's a really interesting process, but it's a very long process. And seeing this interview with Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, like they described that process for them as kind of being that same thing where David Fincher was sending them the dailies, and it was like acting like like a blank canvas for them, and they were just throwing ideas and literally just kind of improvising, trying to create a mood based off of what they were seeing. And the Burial Ground soundtrack really again, I don't know, there's not a whole lot of information about these guys, but from what I did find, and then from just actually, loving this soundtrack so much, it kind of feels like it was maybe that process of where they were just really trying to vibe with what they were seeing, because this movie, when it comes to zombie films, this is definitely one of the most goriest films I've ever seen. It really is, and it's like balls to the wall, and so, and it just has like, and I've said this before, I probably have said it too many times, but I really think, um, and it still happens for me. Um, you could take a movie and it might not have the best, maybe the acting might not be the best, or, maybe the editing might not be even the best. But if it has, or the script isn't, very good. But if the film has this like transportive kind of element where it's like, it's a vibe and you're like in this world, I I adore that. And 9 times out of 10, even if the movie is, technically, kind of a pile of shit, if the vibe is there, I will probably end up loving that movie, and then I will end up probably revisiting it. Just kind of how it is. I mean, I think an example of that kind of thing for me is, with, is why and how I became such a a fan and fell in love with Herschel Gordon Lewis movies, you know, because his movies are kind of garbage, but they're just amazing. And so, and with Burial Ground, I think it has, the cast is really great. I think this movie's actually, you know, again, it's super raw, it's super nasty, it's very perverse, it's super gory, totally demented, but it's just such a raw film. But I actually think the acting in this film is the cast is really really great. I think the cinematography is great, and then being at the show is about the music and the composers. The music is just incredible. The whole atmosphere is just incredible. So it's got all those components. You know, it's not. I'm not. I didn't fall in love with this movie just because of the atmosphere. So, but amazing stuff, amazing stuff, and I can't recommend this movie enough. And definitely check out the soundtrack. It's an incredible thing. Alicio Mancuso and Berto Pisano. I'm gonna, you know, in my travels, see if I can. It's probably online somewhere, but it would be really awesome to buy or find a way of buying the soundtrack, a physical media version of Burial Ground, because it just fucking rules. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.